The morning sun hung low over the small farming town of Millfield. Dust drifted across the empty road as 72-year-old Walter Hayes slowly climbed down from his aging pickup truck. Walter wasn't rich. He wasn't powerful. And he certainly wasn't the kind of man people expected to challenge authority. For nearly 50 years, he had worked the same family farm his father and grandfather had worked before him. His hands were rough, his back was bent, and his clothes were faded from decades under the sun. But what Walter lacked in power, he made up for in one thing. Patience. And on this particular morning, patience was about to change everything. Because Sheriff Randall Brooks believed he had finally beaten the old farmer. And he couldn't have been more wrong. The trouble had started 6 months earlier. Millfield had always been a quiet town where everybody knew everybody. But when Sheriff Brooks took office, things began to change. At first, people welcomed him. He promised modernization. Better roads. More development. More business opportunities. The town council loved his speeches. Many residents applauded his plans. But Walter noticed something strange. Every new project seemed to benefit the same handful of people. Large landowners received tax breaks. Developers gained permits almost overnight. Meanwhile, small farmers were hit with inspections, fines, and endless paperwork. Nobody wanted to say anything. Sheriff Brooks had become one of the most influential men in town. People feared crossing him. Walter included. At least for a while. One afternoon, a county inspector arrived at Walter's farm. The inspector walked around for nearly 2 hours. 3 days later, Walter received a notice. A $38,000 fine. According to the report, several structures on his property violated newly updated zoning regulations. Walter stared at the letter. His hands shook. $38,000 might as well have been $1 million. He could never afford it. If he failed to pay, the county could place a lien on the farm. The land his family had owned for generations could disappear. Walter drove straight to the sheriff's office. Sheriff Brooks greeted him with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "I'm sorry, Walter," Brooks said. "Rules are rules." Walter placed the notice on the desk. "There has to be some mistake." "There isn't. These barns have stood here for 40 years. The regulations changed. And nobody told us." Brooks leaned back. The information was public. Walter left feeling helpless. But something about the conversation bothered him. The sheriff looked too pleased. Almost as if he'd been expecting Walter to come. Over the next few months, things got worse. More fines arrived. More inspections. More warnings. Walter soon learned he wasn't alone. Several small farmers were facing similar problems. Oddly enough, large commercial landowners weren't. No matter how many violations residents reported, inspectors never seemed interested in those properties. A pattern was emerging. And Walter wasn't the only one noticing it. One evening, while drinking coffee at the local diner, Walter met an elderly retired clerk named Margaret Dawson. Margaret had worked for the county records office for nearly 30 years. After hearing Walter's story, she lowered her voice. "Something isn't right." Walter nodded. "I know." Margaret glanced around the diner. Then she leaned closer. "Years ago, I handled land permits and zoning documents. And I remember seeing files connected to some of the properties now receiving special treatment." Walter frowned. "What kind of files?" Margaret hesitated. "The kind people don't want anyone finding." That conversation stayed in Walter's mind for weeks. Then one rainy afternoon, he made a decision. If nobody else would look for answers, he would. The county archive building sat at the edge of town. Most people never visited. Dust covered the shelves. Boxes filled forgotten rooms. Records dating back decades were stacked everywhere. Walter spent days searching. Then weeks. Every morning he worked his farm. Every afternoon he studied documents. Many people thought he was wasting his time. Sheriff Brooks certainly did. When he heard rumors about Walter's investigation, he laughed. Let him look. The sheriff wasn't worried. After all, what could an old farmer possibly find? 1 month later, Walter nearly gave up. He had searched thousands of pages. Nothing. No proof. No answers. Then he noticed something strange. Several property records referenced a development agreement from 22 years earlier. Yet the actual agreement was missing. Every document pointed toward it. None contained it. It was as if someone had intentionally removed the file. That discovery changed everything. Walter returned every day. He searched deeper. Eventually, an archive employee directed him toward an old storage room that hadn't been catalogued in years. Inside stood rows of forgotten filing cabinets. Many were locked. Others barely opened. Walter spent hours sorting through dusty folders. Then, near sunset, he found it. An old brown folder hidden behind a damaged drawer. No label. No markings. Just age-stained paper. Walter slowly opened it. And his heart nearly stopped. Inside were copies of agreements, maps, signatures, and correspondence. The documents revealed that decades earlier, several influential families had received special land classifications that should have expired years ago. Instead, those classifications had quietly remained active. The records also showed something even worse. Recent amendments had been approved improperly. The signatures authorizing them were linked to Sheriff Brooks and several county officials. Walter stared at the pages. For a long moment, he couldn't believe what he was seeing. Then he smiled. Because he finally understood. The fines against small farmers weren't random. They were part of a system designed to pressure landowners into selling property cheaply. Developers would then acquire the land for future projects. The entire scheme suddenly made sense. Walter made copies of everything. Lots of copies. Then he contacted a regional journalist. A woman named Emily Carter. Emily had spent years investigating local government corruption. When Walter showed her the folder, she immediately recognized its importance. "This is huge," she said. "Can you verify it?" Emily nodded. "I know exactly how." For 3 weeks, Emily investigated quietly. She interviewed former officials. Reviewed records. Compared signatures. Cross-checked permits. The evidence kept growing. Every trail led back to the sheriff's office. And every new discovery strengthened Walter's case. Meanwhile, Sheriff Brooks remained confident. He believed the old farmer had exhausted himself chasing ghosts. When another court hearing arrived regarding Walter's fines, Brooks walked into the courthouse smiling. He expected an easy victory. Most people did. Walter sat alone at one table. The sheriff sat with attorneys at the other. The outcome seemed obvious. Until Walter carried in an old folder. Brooks noticed it immediately. His smile faded. Just slightly. Not enough for most people to notice. But Walter saw it. And that was all he needed. The hearing began. County attorneys presented their arguments. They described zoning violations. Regulatory concerns. Financial penalties. Everything proceeded exactly as expected. Then the judge asked Walter if he wished to respond. The old farmer slowly stood. His hands trembled slightly. But his voice remained steady. "Yes, Your Honor." Walter placed the folder on the table. The room grew quiet. One by one, he presented the documents. Development agreements. Property classifications. Expired authorizations. Questionable approvals. Then came the signatures. The courtroom atmosphere changed instantly. People began whispering. Attorneys exchanged nervous looks. The judge carefully reviewed each page. Brooks no longer looked confident. He looked worried. Very worried. Then Emily Carter entered the courtroom. She wasn't alone. Several reporters followed behind her. The story had already been prepared. The investigation was complete. All they needed was confirmation. And Walter's folder provided exactly that. For the first time in years, Sheriff Brooks found himself answering questions instead of giving orders. Hard questions. Questions he couldn't avoid. Questions backed by documents. Questions supported by evidence. His explanations quickly fell apart. Within days, state investigators arrived. Additional records were seized. Several officials resigned. Multiple contracts were suspended. The zoning fines against small farmers were frozen pending review. And Sheriff Randall Brooks was placed under investigation. The man who believed he controlled everything suddenly had no control at all. As for Walter, he returned to his farm. He wasn't interested in fame. He didn't give television interviews. He didn't celebrate. Instead, he repaired fences, fed livestock, and watched another sunrise over the land his family had worked for generations. Several months later, the county formally dismissed all penalties against Walter and dozens of other farmers. New oversight measures were introduced. Land records became publicly accessible. For the first time in years, people felt their voices mattered again. One evening, Margaret Dawson visited Walter's farm. The two sat on the porch watching the sunset. "You know," Margaret said, smiling, "most people would have given up." Walter chuckled. "Maybe. So why didn't you?" The old farmer looked toward the field stretching beyond the horizon. Then he answered quietly. "Because truth doesn't disappear just because someone hides it in a drawer." Margaret smiled. "And sometimes?" Walter nodded. "Sometimes all it takes is opening an old folder." The wind drifted across the fields. The sun slowly disappeared below the horizon. And for the first time in a very long time, justice had finally found its way home.